Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you. And it's A to Z of Catholicism here again. And C is for communion. But I'm not going to be talking about Holy Communion. I'm talking about something else entirely. I'm talking about communion with the church and the communion of the church. And I'm also talking about people who break communion. Now, I once had the misfortune to go on holiday with a small book, which turned out to be the worst book I've ever picked up any time ever. And I only had this one book, so was forced to read it. It was The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne. Don't ever try and read it; it's boring. And it's a story about 18th century Boston, which was the only English-speaking theocracy that has ever existed. Boston was a colony of Puritans who were worse, if it's possible to be worse, than the Ayatollahs in Iran. And one of the subjects of the book is the practice of shunning. Shunning. Now, to shun somebody, you know what that means. It means to avoid them and not to talk to them. But in Protestant churches, it used to be the case that somebody would be shunned as a matter of policy. It was a specific punishment on sinners that they would be shunned. And this still apparently goes on in very, very strict Protestant communities. And it's quite devastating for the person who's been brought up in that very strict community because it means that nobody will speak to them. They've got no social life at all, and they are completely cut off from all human contact. So it's almost like sort of, condemning them to death, but not quite. Now, the thing about shunning, it is actually got biblical precedent. It is based on certain passages of the Bible. Now, for example, the second letter of St. John, which is very short, says, if I can find it in my Bible here, John 2, second letter of John, so 2 John, after 1 John and before 3 John, it says, where's it gone? Jude, Revelation. Now it's, yes, here we are. It's a very, very short letter. It's literally a few paragraphs. And it says, um, if anyone comes to you, this is verse 10, and does not bring this doctrine, do not receive him into the home or give him any greeting. For he who greets him shares in his wicked work. So St. John says if somebody is a heretic, don't let them into your house and don't even greet them in the street. And if they greet you, just ignore them. So that is one of the biblical things about shunning. Now that's St. John, but also Matthew 18 has got this. It's part of the discourse on the church. Matthew 18, 15 to 17 has the following. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take 1 or 2 others along with you, that every word may be confirmed by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. That is to say, an outcast. In other words, kick him out of the church. So actually, it's not just shunning, it's actually what we call nowadays excommunication. That's actually in the Gospel of St. Matthew. And then St. Paul has got something very similar. It's 1 Corinthians. Let's try and find that. 1 Corinthians 5:3. He says in the 5th chapter, it's actually reported that there is immorality among you, and of a kind that is not found even among the pagans. For a man is living with his father's wife. And you are arrogant. Ought you not rather to mourn? Let him who has done this be removed from among you. So St. Paul says, kick him out as well. So the practice of excommunication, which is not much understood, and the practice of shunning, the practice of excommunication as a sort of a penalty handed down by the church has biblical roots, and this is rather important. Yet, of course, nobody can really understand it nowadays. So, from the earliest times, people were thrown out of the church for immoral behavior and for heresy. Now, but this is important. What's the purpose of this? If you get excommunicated, what is the purpose of excommunication? And what is the purpose of shunning? Well, shunning is cruel, and shunning is very harmful to individuals, whereas excommunication is supposed to be good for you. In other words, the purpose of excommunication is what's called the medicina salutis. It's supposed to be harsh medicine, but a medicine that cures you. The idea of excommunicating you is to prove to you, to show you that one, you're wrong, two, you've done wrong, you've cut off from the body of Christ, and to make it apparent to you the urgency of repentance and changing your ways. So we only excommunicate people in order to encourage them, quite strongly encourage them to change their ways, to induce repentance. Now, a very famous occasion where this happened was when the Emperor Theodosius was excommunicated by St. Ambrose of Milan. Now, St. Ambrose excommunicated him because the Emperor Theodosius, he said, was responsible for the massacre in the stadium at Thessaloniki, which happened in 390. And until the emperor did public penance, he was not admitted to Holy Communion or to the community of the church. So, being banned from Holy Communion, he was excommunicated in order to induce him to repent. So, that was a good thing, surely. And other emperors and kings have also been excommunicated for their bad behavior. Yes and no. Because what has happened is, for example, this happened with King John. Now, King John was placed under interdict, which is a sort of lower form of excommunication. But along with King John, the whole of England was placed under interdict, which meant there was all the churches were shut, there were no baptisms, there were no funerals, there was no nothing, until King John caved in and repented. I can't remember what the whole controversy was about. I think it was largely about the appointment of bishops. And King John caved in. And so that was good. I mean, and the Pope won his point. And King John, I suppose, lost face, as you said. But it was also done with Henry VIII. Henry VIII was excommunicated, but he died unrepentant, which was a great pity. Elizabeth I was excommunicated, and she was by the bull Regnans in Excelsis. No, before the bull Regnans in Excelsis, she was excommunicated. She had 1 month to turn up in, or 3 months to turn up in Rome to plead her case, to appeal. She didn't turn up, obviously. So then the excommunication was made permanent, and the bull Regnans in Excelsis was published, calling upon people to overthrow her, as she'd been dethroned by the Pope. That didn't work either. Now, Elizabeth I could be excommunicated because she was a lapsed Catholic, and she was supposed to have been a Catholic. She claimed she was a Catholic during the reign of Queen Mary. When Elizabeth I died, 1603, she was succeeded by her cousin James VI and First of Scotland, and for the Catholics of England, a very small group, that was okay. Well, it was better because James had never been a Catholic, and therefore James was not excommunicated. You can only be excommunicated if you're a Catholic. So, for example, James was not somebody who had to go and submit to the Pope and repent and this, that, and the other. James's wife was also a Catholic, funnily enough. So people thought that James would be a much better king for the Catholics. He turned out to be even worse after the gunpowder plot. Now, so it's meant to be medicine that brings you back into the fold, but it doesn't often work. Now, right at the beginning of the church's history, there was something called letters of communion or letters of recommendation. Now, if you look at 2 Corinthians 3:1, St. Paul is talking to the Corinthians and he says, are we beginning to commend ourselves again, or do we need, as some do, letters of recommendation to you or from you? Now, what does this mean? in the Roman Empire, the Christian communities were quite scattered. There would be, let's say, a Christian community in Rome, there'd be another one perhaps in Milan or Padua or Naples or something like that. But so if you were a person who turned up in the Christian community, people would say, well, who are you? And you say, here's my letter of recommendation from where I come from, Thessaloniki and this, that, and the other. And you remember the character Phoebe, the deaconess, who carries this letter. She was the postman of St. Paul. And people did travel long distances, and they brought with them these letters of recommendation. And these letters of recommendation meant the person was to be admitted to Holy Communion and to be treated as a Catholic. They were proper, in good standing. And this still goes on. Every priest has what's called a celebrate, which is effectively, it's like a little card, an identity card, which celebrate means let him celebrate. He may celebrate. And so the person can be admitted to concelebrate or say mass and so on and so forth. So right from the beginning, you had this little certificate of Catholicity, which meant you were not a heretic. If you were a heretic, you wouldn't get one. And there were heretics right at the beginning of the church's history. Now, um, so you enjoyed all the privileges of being Catholic, and you had a little certificate to show it. Now, your baptism, in other words, was valid, and you hadn't done anything to lose the privileges of your baptism. When you get excommunicated, you lose the privileges of your baptism. Though you're still baptized, you're not allowed to exercise the privileges of your baptism. Now, nowadays it's really quite complex. Who is in communion with the church and who is not in communion with the church is complex. Now, Catholics who have been excommunicated are not in communion with the church. Marcel Lefebvre died out of communion with the church. He was excommunicated by a decree of Pope Paul VI. I was about 14 or 15 when this happened, but I remember it well, because he had ordained or consecrated some bishops without the Pope's permission. And therefore, as the guy who'd done the consecration of these bishops and the co-consecrators were excommunicated, as were those who became bishops at his hands. They were real bishops, but they were not in communion with Rome. One of them is that guy who came from Wimbledon, Father, I can't remember what his name was, who became a Lefebvrist bishop. So Archbishop Lefebvre was excommunicated. And we say late ferende, sententiae ferende, by decree. A decree was published saying, as from this moment, he is no longer in the Catholic Church, he's been excommunicated. And Marcel Lefebvre could have repented and gone to the Pope and asked for the excommunication to be lifted, but he never did. It wasn't heresy, it was disobedience. It was consecrating bishops without the permission of the Holy See. When you do a consecration of a bishop, the bishop is appointed a bishop by the Pope, and therefore the Pope has given his permission for the bishop to be consecrated. When you do a ordination of a priest, you have something called the demissorial letters, which gives the bishop permission to ordain that priest, saying that the priest has been properly trained, the priest has been properly examined, etc., and he's kosher, and therefore he can be ordained. Now, there was a wonderful case in Rome where a bloke got ordained by forging the demissorial letters, and his ordination was annulled. Quite extraordinary, that case. I remember I was in Rome at the time. Now, then there are Catholics who have been excommunicated late sententiae. These are the ones who have undergone excommunication, automatic excommunication. Now, there's certain crimes that carry the penalty of automatic excommunication. One is assaulting the sovereign pontiff. So it was assumed by many that all the Italian troops that had attacked Rome in 1870 were excommunicated. But other people said, no, it wasn't them, they were just following orders. It was, in fact, the King of Italy who was excommunicated. Victor Emmanuel II was excommunicated for attacking the sovereign pontiff. Other people said, well, he made war on the papal state. He didn't actually go and punch Pius IX in the face. So which is it? So these types of excommunication are very hazy. Somebody who desecrates the Blessed Sacrament is automatically excommunicated. Somebody who procures an abortion is directly and with full knowledge is automatically excommunicated. In America, it's raging, this thing. Is Joe Biden excommunicated or not? Now, the thing that makes it difficult is this, that you don't need a decree of excommunication. The fact of you've done something carries with it automatically the excommunication. The American bishops have not wanted to follow this up. It's very rare for a politician to be excommunicated. However, Lord Strickland was excommunicated or placed under interdict in the 1920s, the Prime Minister of Malta. He was excommunicated by the Archbishop of Malta. I can't remember what for. I really can't remember what for, but it was a bad thing anyway. Nowadays, the church rose back very strongly from excommunicating politicians. The only politician I can think of who's been excommunicated was, in fact, Lord Strickland. I think he might have actually only been placed under interdict, but I'm not sure. In Italy in the 1970s, it was said if you voted for the Communist Party, you would be excommunicated. And in the 1950s, don't forget, in those days, the Communist Party in Italy was a Stalinist party. So it supported Joseph Stalin and all his policies. So quite right, I think people should have been excommunicated for that. But, bringing excommunication into political elections in particular is rather bad. Now, what about Catholics who have left the church? Now, it used to be the case that you could go to a notary, make a declaration saying, I leave the Catholic Church, and then the notary would stamp it, and you had then left the Catholic Church, and you were out of communion with the Catholic Church. Now, this happened in Germany. If you didn't want to pay the church tax, you could do this. And then when you died, the church could say, sorry, love, you can't be buried in church. That's what they would say, because you haven't paid up, and you've said you've left the church. If you've left the church, you're not going to be buried in church. That creates a lot of bad feeling. And of course, there's a very famous case of somebody who was judged to be immoral and they refused her a funeral. The charming Edith Piaf. Oh, that creates a huge stink. Nobody would ever do that nowadays. Now, but the other thing is this. Then they changed canon law and they introduced into canon law what is called the Hotel California clause. It's not actually called that, which says that once you're in the Catholic Church, you can never leave it. Because your baptism is permanent. Therefore, you can't erase your baptism. So once you're baptized as a Catholic, you're a Catholic till you die. And this, of course, happened. This was applied recently. A clever young woman was marrying a man who'd been married twice before. And because he'd been baptized as a Catholic, and both times he'd married his previous wives in non-Catholic places, and as a Catholic, you've got to get married in church. She then went to Westminster Cathedral, her local parish, and said, I want to marry this guy, and he's free to marry because he's never been married. And that guy was Boris Johnson. And she was Carrie Johnson. And of course, the lovely Allegra Mostyn Owen, he'd married her in some other church, and he'd also married Marina Wheeler in some other place. And he was a Catholic. Boris was baptized a Catholic. It's true he'd undergone a service of confirmation as a boy at Eton in the Anglican Church, but even though he was a lapsed Catholic, he was still a baptized Catholic. So he was free to marry in a Catholic church, something he'd never done before, and she had never been married, so they got married in the Catholic Church. I would imagine she knew canon law. Boris, I don't think, is that au fait with canon law, frankly. I don't think Boris is particularly religious, but she's very devout, obviously. So the Hotel California clause in canon law meant that Boris was able to marry Carrie in Westminster Cathedral. And of course, it does mean that people who may have got baptized as Catholics but have never practiced the Catholic faith and married 6 women in various places, or 6 men in various places, then can suddenly turn up a Catholic church and say, I want to get married. So that is a interesting one. So Boris was not excommunicated, I don't think. If he'd been excommunicated, they could have refused to marry him. Because if you're excommunicated, you don't have to marry them. But Boris was not excommunicated, unless, of course, we don't know. Maybe he was excommunicated and the excommunication was lifted. I don't know. Now, usually, I think children can't be excommunicated. You do get excommunicated if you are a Catholic and then you go off and join another religion. You're automatically excommunicated because you can't come back to the Catholic Church. Oh, I'm still Catholic. No, sorry. You've got to get that sorted out before that. Unless you're under a certain age. Now, for example, my dear nanny, Miss Pearl, she used to go to church with her mother, and she said to me, she said, and her mother said one day, I don't like this here. I'm going to the other place, and dragged Miss Pearl off to the Anglicans. And so they went to the Anglicans. And then Miss Pearl was a very devout Anglican for many years. And then one day she said, I don't like these women priests. And I said, well, blah, blah, blah. I said, what are you going to do about it? Why didn't you become a Catholic? She said, well, she said, I used to be a Catholic. I said, well, that's great. I said, well, what happened? And she told me the story. I said, how old were you? And she said, oh, I was 11. I said, well, that's great because you can't be excommunicated under the age of 12. So you just go off to Westminster Cathedral, go to confession and blah, blah, blah. You're in the Catholic Church. Because I wasn't having Miss Pearl having to jump through a whole load of hoops to get back into the Catholic Church. She was an 85 or whatever by that stage. But anyway, it was great. And so you say she wasn't excommunicated. She was just because of her age at the time. It was her mother's fault. Her mother was excommunicated, but she's gone to her reward a long time ago. Now, what about Christians who have never been Catholics? They're not excommunicated. They're not. They're like James I was not excommunicated. They've never been in communion with the Catholic Church. They are baptized, so they're Christians, but they're not Catholics. We don't hold anything against them for not being Catholics, but they are not in communion with the Catholic Church. So there's a difference between excommunicated and not in communion. They are in communion with each other, but they're not in communion with us. Now, the Anglican Church is very complex, as you know, because it is a federation, confederation, or a communion, actually, to use the correct term. That's the term they use. The Anglican Communion consists of numerous independent churches. These independent churches have drifted apart in recent decades in doctrine and in practice. So, for example, there are some very stalwart Anglicans in places like Uganda who are horrified by what's going on in TEC, the Episcopal Church, formerly known as Accusa, the Episcopal Church of the USA. And they're constantly quarreling. And every time they held the Lambeth Conference, once every 10 years, all these people who are supposed to be in communion with each other come along and denounce each other. So their communion is stretched to breaking point. One of the things Anglicans tend not to do is excommunicate each other. And so they haven't excommunicated each other. Although there was that famous Anglican bishop, I think, was it Peter Akinola from Nigeria, who tried to exorcise some, do an exorcism on some Anglicans who were demonstrating outside the Lambeth Conference and so on. Anyway, they're not in communion with each other, except as a sort of a legal fiction, it seems to me. But that's their affair, not mine, thank goodness. They're not in communion with us because they do not believe the same things that we believe. And therefore, they cannot be admitted to Holy Communion. In danger of death, they could be admitted to Holy Communion if they're first questioned that they have a proper belief about Holy Communion. but their beliefs on what the Eucharist is are very wide-ranging, and therefore they are they do not share our beliefs. They do not share our beliefs on a variety of matters. They certainly don't share our beliefs on the supremacy of the Pope and on the apostolic succession and so on and so forth. I'll give you a good example about the Anglicans' lack of communion. As you know, 1994, was it, the Anglicans ordained women, first to the diaconate and then to the ministerial priesthood. Although Anglicans only started using the word priest in the 1970s. Before then, they used the word minister or vicar or something. Then what happened was, in the Anglican Diocese of Sydney, Australia, they had a synod which had a talk and passed a resolution on lay presidency of the Eucharist, which meant that any bloke or Sheila, as I believe they're known in that part, any person could preside at the Eucharist. So, in other words, if the vicar didn't turn up, a layperson could take the service and do Holy Communion. Whereupon all the other Anglicans in the world exploded with rage, saying, well, what was the point of having the ordination of women if you don't need to be ordained to preside at the Eucharist? Now, because the point about this was the ones in Sydney, Australia, don't believe that the ordination ceremony confers any particular powers on the person who is ordained. So what's the point of having female vicars or indeed male vicars when they don't actually have any special role to play? Which, they have a special role maybe to play in the administration of the church, but anybody can play that role. So now, we're not in communion with the Anglicans, we're not in communion with the Baptists, we're not in communion with the Methodists and so on and so forth. But we do want to have ecumenical relations with them. The C of E practices what is sometimes called Eucharistic hospitality. Anybody who's in good standing with their own church can roll up to a C of E church and receive Holy Communion. Catholics should not do this because we're not in communion with the C of E. We do not believe what they believe. And the Eucharist is a sign of our unity of belief. That's really important. Our communion with each other is based on common sacraments, but common belief. Now, the unity of faith. What about the Orthodox? Now, this one's an interesting one. The Orthodox are 22 different churches which are all in communion with each other. So the Russian Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Romanian Orthodox Church, the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Okay, fine. There are also a whole load of Orthodox churches that have been expelled, which are not in communion with the canonical Orthodox churches. So there are quite a few. For example, the Church of Montenegro is not recognized by other Orthodox churches. The Orthodox churches are proper churches. They have real priests. They have real bishops. They are not heretics. They are different from us in their liturgy, but that doesn't matter. And they refuse. They do not acknowledge papal supremacy. Many of them do not acknowledge the Immaculate Conception. Some of them do not claim not to acknowledge purgatory, but they do really, in my humble opinion. The Orthodox, we are not in communion with the Orthodox because the Orthodox bishops have not been appointed by the Pope. And the Orthodox priests, who are real priests, have not been appointed by a Catholic bishop, and so on and so forth. We're not in communion with the Orthodox, but we acknowledge that they are a proper church. And we acknowledge that they are right believers. We share a unity of faith with the Orthodox, though many of the Orthodox deny this. But on the whole, we are united in faith with the Orthodox. One of the things is, so if an Orthodox person, now this is how it gets tricky. A Catholic goes on holiday to Cyprus and says to an Orthodox priest, oh, I can't find a Catholic church around here and I want to go to Mass on Sunday. A can I go to Holy Communion in your lovely church? Depending on the Orthodox priest, some will say yes, some will say no, go away, you heretic. But some will say yes. It all depends on what Orthodox priest, because some of the Orthodox are bitterly anti-Catholic for cultural reasons, and some are quite pro-Catholic. If you go to a Coptic church, incidentally, we recognize the Copts as being right believers, although the Orthodox don't. It's funny that. The Copts and the Ethiopians are called what are called Oriental Orthodox, but we recognize them as being okay. And they, generally speaking, are very friendly to us. So if you go to Armenia and places like that, and you say, can I go to Holy Communion in your lovely church? They'll probably say yes. If an Orthodox comes here, what are we going to do? We could say, well, number one thing we'll say, look here, why don't you go to the Orthodox church? There's one down the road. Is there one down the road? There must be, or up the road. There's several in London. But they say, oh no, I really prefer it here. Well, okay, fine. Now, as a matter of fact, this is a grey area. In Newport, there were lots of Greeks who were going to the Catholic Church and receiving Holy Communion every Sunday, and nobody said to them, buzz off, which would be counterproductive. In Hove, there were lots of Syrians coming to the Catholic Church and receiving Holy Communion. Many of them were Orthodox. That was because my predecessor didn't really know the difference between Orthodox and Catholic. He assumed they were Catholics. They're not. Greek Orthodox in Arabic, you all speak Arabic, don't you? Yes, is Rum Orthodoxy. Rum means Roman, which in their language means Greek. So when they say, oh, we're Romans, no, sorry, love, you're Greeks. But the Rum are the Greeks. But anyway, most of the Orthodox in the Arab lands don't really understand the difference between Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And therefore, when they come to us, you say, well, you do realize this is a Catholic church. They say, oh, yeah. It's not a problem, really. Quite a few of our Indian brethren, I don't know, I haven't asked them here, who come here, some of them may in fact be Orthodox from South India. There is an Orthodox church in South India. Now, the other thing about this is, we move on to the Eastern Catholic churches. Now, how many Eastern Catholic churches are there? Anybody like to have a go and guess? What? Right, have I got any advance on 3? Have I got any advance on 7? What? Okay, 28 is the answer. I think it's 28. Now, who are these people? Right, the Eastern Catholic churches are Catholics which have a distinctive rite, R-I-T-E, and a distinctive canon law. And therefore, their mass is different. So the Armenian Catholic Church, the Coptic Catholic Church, the Maronites, and the biggest one of the lot are the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. There was a Greek Catholic Church in Bulgaria, for example. There's a Greek Catholic Church in Romania. There's a Greek Catholic Church in Hungary. There's the only place of the Orthodox places without a Greek Catholic Church is actually Greece. In Greece, if you're a Catholic, you're a Latin Catholic, like us. Now, what is a Greek Catholic? It's a bit of a misnomer. It's basically somebody who is identical to an Orthodox, to all intents and purposes, when you look at them, but is in communion with the Pope and is in a church which accepts the authority of the Pope. But their church is autocephalous, which means it has its own head. So, for example, I've met him. The head of the Armenian Catholic Church was Archbishop Jean-Pierre 18 Kasparian when I met him. It's now somebody else. John Paul the 20th, 18th Kasparian was his surname. So they are fully Catholics, and we're fully in communion with them. Now, you know, don't you, in the West Indies, there are lots of Syrians. Yeah, they're Maronites from Lebanon, but there isn't a Maronite church in Trinidad or in Jamaica, so they've essentially become Roman Catholics. Now, we are Roman Catholics, is what the Anglicans call us. We're actually Latin Catholics, whereas they are Armenian Catholics, Greek Catholics, or Hungarian Greek Catholics, Orthodox Greek Catholic. The Orthodox, the Greek Catholic Ukrainian Church is in Wayhouse Street off Oxford Street in London, leading down to Berkeley Square. No, not Berkeley Square, where the American Embassy is, the former American Embassy, Grosvenor Square. It's a converted Baptist chapel, I think. It's very beautiful. And they have Mass there, and you can go there and you would fulfill your obligation and you would receive Holy Communion there, and so on and so forth. Now, the only thing is, of course, that the 28 Catholic Eastern churches are relatively few in numbers. I mean, in Bulgaria, they've got one bishop and about 2,000 people, probably. But in places like Ukraine, they got millions of people, but they're not that many of them. And in their practices, they are indistinguishable from their Orthodox counterparts, except that they are praying for the Pope and they are praying, and their bishop is a Catholic bishop because their bishop is recognized by the Pope. Okay, so those people, now this, of course, we have something, a bit of a problem with this, with schools, school admissions. And I had to draw something up quite sharply. I had to say, look here, an Eastern Catholic and an Orthodox are different things. You mustn't give the Orthodox precedence over Catholics or Eastern Catholics. The Eastern Catholics must have precedence in getting into our schools. The Orthodox have precedence over the Anglicans in getting into our schools. They've actually introduced that now. Yeah, there is an Orthodox primary school, I think, in Croydon, but there are no Orthodox schools, so they like to come to Catholic schools and so on. And they do have precedence over the Anglicans because, as is quite right, because they share with us not complete unity of faith, but 95% of the faith, you know? Okay, I've spoken for quite long enough. Any comeback on this rather eccentric topic? Did you understand? Is this all new to you? Yeah. You see, I mean, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it is all new because a lot of people, you do read about this in the newspapers, excommunications and so on. People just don't understand what it is. Yes, this is one of the things is that this idea of excommunication, automatic excommunication, excommunicatio late sententiae, it's hardly ever followed up. For example, if a priest solicits somebody, if you know what that means, in the confessional, he is automatically excommunicated. If a priest tells the secrets of the confessional, he is automatically excommunicated. That does happen. There was a priest that I heard about who did tell the secrets of the confessional, and the case, he claimed he didn't do it deliberately or something like that. The case was referred to Rome, and he was suspended. A priest getting excommunicated, I'm trying to think of any I've known, but yes, that creature, the Dominican, the one whose spiritual director was a dog and who hung around with that witch called Skylark or whatever she was called, Father Matthew Fox in California, he was excommunicated for being a witch or being, sorry, he said it was creation spirituality. We said it was Wicca. There was a big argument, but we won, and he got excommunicated, and so he's become an Anglican. He was excommunicated. People were howling for his excommunication for a very, 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 very long time. Oh yes, the Prime Minister of Haiti was excommunicated. He was a priest, and he stood for election. He got excommunicated because priests are not allowed to stand for election. He was excommunicated. I can't remember his name. What? No. It was he. They was in the 80s or 90s. He was a Don Bosco priest, SDB, the Salesian. He got excommunicated. There are one or two excommunicated priests around. If you're a priest who then falls in love with a lady, like Father Cutie. Do you remember Father Cutie? It was a lovely story. Somebody photographed Father Cutie on the beach in in Florida, and he was snogging with his girlfriend. And they immediately took this to the newspapers, and it was splashed all over the internet. And Father Cutie immediately discovered he had a vocation to be an Anglican, and he became an Anglican that very afternoon. So I believe Father Cutie is now excommunicated. He had a radio show in Florida. Do Google Father Cutie. He was excommunicated, largely for becoming an Anglican, not for snogging his girlfriend on the beach. You'll be glad to know. Well, I mean, many of these excommunications are very, very comic. I mean, he really did ask for it. Now, you couldn't tell he was a priest. He was only wearing his swimming trunks. Yes. Ah, yeah, yeah. Well, this is in. Yes, well, ex Monsignor Lefebvre was getting old. Monsignor Lefebvre had set up a seminary in Econ in Switzerland. He was getting old. And the church had tolerated Monsignor Lefebvre because they said he's old, he'll die soon, and that'll be great. And then they won't have a bishop to do the ordinations at Econ. He was under some sort of censure for doing ordinations without permission. But when he decided, Richardson or whatever he was called, he had consecrated these three bishops to ensure the continuation of his movement, the Society of Pius X. Therefore, they excommunicated him because he was starting a schism, because it meant that the society would carry on as a sort of a church. He was being a schismatic. He was setting up his own church. Yeah, yeah, basically. He'd been told, do not do this, and he refused. And so he was excommunicated. The other thing is that it's slightly, again, with canon law, it's supposed to be precise, and there's a huge fudge on this. The priests the bishops were excommunicated. The laity weren't excommunicated. So if you go to the Pius X Mass, you're not excommunicated. The priests, it was vague. Why the laity shouldn't be excommunicated, I don't know. The Pope Francis recently decreed that when the priests of the Society of Pope Pius V, X, did a wedding, it was a proper Catholic wedding. That is the outfit that Monsignor Lefebvre founded. Now, it was originally just a priestly society, but then it's sort of by the fact that it's now, you see, to have a religious order or a priestly society presided over by a bishop, you do need the Pope's permission for that, as like Opus Dei and things like that. There is some talk that they will have some reconciliation with the Pius X lot, and they'll make them into a personal prelature. I say they'll have a bishop appointed by the Pope to do what they like doing. But it hasn't happened yet. But there has been this move by the church to sanitize, that's the correct term, the Pius X weddings. Because obviously, if somebody gets married in the Pius X church and they're not really married, they could then do a Boris Johnson, couldn't they? But the other thing is, the whole point about that is they're living in sin, so we don't want that. So they got a sanation of all the weddings. The weddings are okay, because if you're not a Catholic priest, you can't marry Catholics. So presumably, the priests of the Society of Pius X are Catholic priests. But it's a dodgy one. It's really vague. It's really vague. I think the reason why you've never had this spelled out to you is because they didn't want to worry you about this, because they'll keep you awake at night. It's like, oh, is so and so inconvenient, there are a few people who are supposedly Catholics who aren't really Catholics. One is Mike Pence, formerly vice president. He claimed to be a Catholic. He's not really Catholic. He goes to a Protestant church, and he's a member of the Protestant church. But Sarah Palin, do you remember her? Wasn't she great? She was a Catholic, but they dragged her off to the Protestants, and when she was 11, so she's never been excommunicated, I'm glad to say. And so she can come back anytime she wants. Along with the people. And so, yeah. So it's very rare that you ever meet a lay person who's been excommunicated. I mean, I don't think even Edith Piaf was excommunicated. It was just the Archbishop of Paris would not countenance her funeral, which incidentally I think is a very bad idea. Nowadays, I've done lots of. I mean, one of the really ridiculous things is this. Um, that I will do funerals of non-Catholics. Why not? So I'm hardly likely to refuse to do a funeral of a Catholic. Come on, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous to refuse to do a funeral. They're dead, aren't they? And the other thing is, all you're doing is upsetting the relatives and creating a lot of bad feeling, which will never be lived down. So anybody who wants a funeral can have one, as far as I'm concerned. And because the funeral is for the living, then it's also a teaching moment and this, that, and the other. And usually, yes, yes, why not? But usually, if it's a Protestant who's died, it's usually the husband or the wife of a Catholic. Usually, we don't do a requiem mass; we just do a funeral service. But I think it's ridiculous. I mean, I did a guy. His wife was a very devout Catholic, and I did his funeral because he didn't know any Protestant vicars, and he knew me quite well. So I did his funeral. It was directly at the crematorium, but it was the wife organised it all. It was very nice. So, the idea of and this idea of not burying people in consecrated ground is a very bad idea. Luckily, in Britain, we don't have this concept of consecrated ground because every single tomb or grave is consecrated separately. So thank goodness we don't have that. We don't have a little section of the cemetery for the excommunicates and the suicides, I'm happy to say, and Edith P.F. Yeah. Yeah, now you're talking. That is really difficult. The status of the church in China, what happened was the Chinese Patriotic Association had bishops who were real bishops because they'd been consecrated by bishops who had originally been consecrated by proper bishops, but had been approved by the Pope. It was an excommunicated bunch of people because they were stooges of the Communist Party. But it now seems they have been sanitized. It now seems that they have been sanitized. But the terrible thing is they're still stooges of the Communist Party, but they've been sanitized. One of the things is, of course, in the time of Queen Elizabeth I, there were massing priests. That is to say, priests who had been parish priests in the time of Queen Mary, and then who had been deprived, kicked out of their parishes. And these guys went around saying mass quietly for devout Catholics, and they were not excommunicated. But if you were a priest who'd stayed in your parish and taken the act of sworn the oath about the act of supremacy and recognized Elizabeth as head of the church, you were excommunicated. There's no doubt about that. You were excommunicated, but the massing priests were not excommunicated. And some of them lived on into the 1880s. Any other questions? I mean, Boris is not excommunicated. I find that quite extraordinary. But he's not, or wasn't excommunicated. Maybe he was, maybe he was sanated. That's the technical term, sanated. Any other? No, you wouldn't get excommunicated for that. General immorality. I'm thinking about what happened between him and Petronella Wyatt, but let's not talk about that. We're being recorded. But I mean, also I would have thought getting confirmed as an Anglican would have got him excommunicated. He might have had to repent from that. He was only 14 or 15 at the time. I don't know. I would be absolutely sure that the priests at Westminster Cathedral would have sorted that out. They wouldn't have been caught out by anything there. They wouldn't have done the wedding without being absolutely sure that she was a Catholic and he was a Catholic. You can't be a member of two churches. That's one of the basic rules of communion. If you're in communion with one lot, you're out of communion with the other lot. You can't be in two churches at once. You can be if. Yeah. Yes, the parents have got to decide what the child is going to be brought up as, and it should be brought up according to its baptism. So if the child's baptized a Catholic in the Catholic Church, it's to be brought up as a Catholic. If it's baptized as an Anglican, it's to be brought up as an Anglican. What do you mean? They have, yeah, yes, yeah. Mm. Mm. But you're not a member of the other lot. Well, you shouldn't have, because the vicar and so on and so forth, they you only repeat a ceremony because you're acknowledging the first ceremony was invalid. So you would only rebaptize some. Hmm? You Yeah, good. You would only rebaptize somebody if you were under the impression that their first baptism was doubtful. So if you're an Anglican, you've been baptized, you get your Anglican baptism certificate, and you say, yes, you want to become Catholic, that's fine. You have an act of reception, but you don't rebaptize them because their Anglican baptism is completely valid. However, if your baptism was, if you're a member of, let's say you're a Baptist as a child, but you never got baptized as an adult, then you'd have to be baptized, not be rebaptized. You can only be baptized once. Again, if you are a member of some body like, I believe, which doesn't practice baptism, like the Quakers don't practice baptism, then you'd have to be baptized. Though we generally recognize the Quakers as Christians, but they're not baptized, therefore they're not Christians. They're nice people, though. Can I just be clear about that? They're really nice people. Most people sort of think that when we say you're not baptized, you're not a Christian, we're saying you're a horrible person. But we don't mean that, do we? No. Yes. Ah, the old days. Yes. You'd baptize them. Yeah. Yeah. Mm. Mm. No, no. You would baptize them. If, let's say, the mother is a Catholic and she has a baby and the baby is looking a bit poorly, she would baptize it. That baby is a Catholic because it's the will of the mother who is a Catholic who wants the baby to be baptized. Then the baby, if they recover, will be taken to the church and have the ceremonies supplied. In other words, the candle, the white garment, and the anointings would be done to make up, because in the emergency baptism, only the baptism was done. What I don't understand. Oh, yes. Is if someone was not a Catholic, yeah, and did something that would cause them to be excommunicated, yeah, if they were a Catholic. Yes, yes. But then they decide they were converted. Yeah. And came into full communion. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Because they were never a Catholic, weren't, yeah, anything. Yeah. But when they were not, yes, yes, in communion, they did something. Yeah, 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 yeah. When for years and years and years carrying this burden, yes, went to ask for confession. Yes. And were told they would never get it. They would never get absolved. Why not? Why wouldn't they be absolved? Because what they did was terrible. Yeah, I mean, all the more reason they should be absolved from it if it was terrible. The point is that there is no sin that cannot be absolved. Now, people who, let's say, have practiced genocide, shall we say, um, and then they become Catholics, if they've not been baptized, they don't have to go to confession because their baptism washes away all their sins. If they had been baptized, they've got to confess, insofar as humanly possible, all the sins they've committed since their baptism. And then they would be absolved, and then they'd be received into the church the next day. So that's one of the things is this, that none of us here are Jewish. No. Okay. We all eat pork. Yes. Yes. Our Jewish brethren do not hold that against us. They don't, because we don't. We're not in the covenant. We haven't undertaken the covenant with God not to eat pork, not to eat shellfish, not to eat blood and things like that. They don't. They don't sort of think that God, the goyim, it's appalling them eating pork. No, they don't. That's fine. Now, if you are, for example, not a Catholic, and then become a Catholic at the age of 60, the priest isn't going to say, you missed Mass for 60 years because you weren't a Catholic. One of the things about being a Catholic is you are obliged to keep the rules of the Catholic Church. You're obliged to live by canon law. But if you're not a Catholic, you're not obliged to live by canon law. So the obvious way this applies is if you're a Catholic like Boris and you don't get married in the Catholic Church, you're not married. You're obliged to get married in the Catholic Church in front of a Catholic priest. However, people like, Prince William and Catherine Middleton, they have a proper marriage because they're both Anglicans and they got married in an Anglican church. That's absolutely fine. And two people who get married in the registry office, they get properly married as long as as long as one of them is not a Catholic. They are not held to keep Catholic canon law. They can eat meat on a Friday, etc., etc., etc. Well, I thought this would be a rather short talk. Anything else on this? Anything else on this? Okay. Are you all happy with the? Have you all learnt something? Oh, well, that's good. So, well, that's it. And next week, D is for the devil. Okay. All the best. Bye.